Part of the charm of creating placemats is that they require a small amount of fabric, can be made at a minimal amount of time, and add a festive look to a table setting. With the stitch and turn technique, you can learn a novel quilting technique, mastering it on a small project. Here's the easy way to create stitch and turn placemats. When working with this basic quilting sewing technique, we're going to start off with fabric a little bit larger than the finished size of the placemat. A good placemat size is 19 by 13 in the finished size. So for the fabric, make it at least an inch larger in all directions. We have 20 by 14. Use a rotary cutter, ruler, and mat to cut layers, 2 layers, and then a batting layer. Perhaps you may have pre-cut fat quarter fabrics. They're about 22 by 18. This is a great project for fat quarters. Before we do the sewing or the marking on the placemat, you may want to cut the binding. Since we have the curved edges on our placemat, I'm going to cut the binding on the bias. And to work with a bias cut, a quick bias cut, you may want to consider using a binding buddy, a long ruler, the traditional width of binding, 2.5 inches, and at the end it's angled at a 45-degree angle, so that you simply align the cut fabric and the ruler edge, and then cut along the ruler. Then after cutting, making that initial cut, since it's 2.5 inches wide, measuring is simple. You just align the cut edges together, ruler and fabric, and cut strips. And you simply cut enough strips to bind all the edges of however many placemats you're creating. Save this ruler because we're going to use it for marking, or you could use a traditional ruler as well. Now for marking, we're going to again work with the bias. If you do not have a ruler with a 45-degree angle, simply fold the fabric in half, making a 45-degree line or a bias line, and press, establishing the bias. Or just place your ruler along the lower edge and at the corner. It's important to start at the corner, as you'll see later on, and then mark. Either way, just mark that 45-degree line. The quilting that we like to use is about 2 inches, a 2-inch grid. So we'll move this over so that we have a 2-inch mark, and then mark all bias lines that go in this direction. And chalk is my favorite to use for this instance because it holds long enough, but then after the fact you can rub it right out. Then after marking all lines in one direction, start at another corner in the opposite direction. Get that lined and mark. And I'm just marking a few right now, but you can get the general idea of how this goes together. And mark until the top of the quilt has been gridded. Now if you're making a quilt, you may want to have the markings just a little bit further apart, and you could do the same thing. Just mark the top of a small lap quilt or baby quilt. Now this placemat top has been marked, and I'm going to pin the layers together. Here's an option of securing all the layers. And pin in the middle of a grid, and just initially put the pins in without clasping them close. Some pins, safety pins, are tough to close, and to save your hands, what we like to use is a quick clip, and the clip helps us underneath the pin just to save your hands. Oop, let me get a little bit more leverage there. Save the hands to close the area. One more time. And you can see that you would do pinning more of the quilt top or the placemat top than I've done right now. After finishing the pinning, then it's time to do the stitching. The stitch and turn technique begins in the upper right-hand corner. And I'm going to stitch following the line marked on the fabric. And then when I reach the end, I'm going to turn it and then stitch the next row that I see. Stop the fabric, stop stitching, turn, find the next row stitching. And when I stitch and turn, the majority of the fabric will be to the left of my needle, not in the bed of the machine. Now, I know we're working with a small piece, but when working with a larger quilt, the same technique works and works very well. So I'll start stitching in the upper corner, doesn't matter which really corner you start sewing in, and set your machine for a comparable stitch length for quilting, like 2.5 or 3.0 millimeters. I have an open toe foot. That open toe foot, I think, makes it easier to do the stitching. The pins have been placed in the center of the grid so that they should be clear of your stitching. And then as you reach the end of the seam, raise your presser foot. Also raise the needle and the presser foot, pivot, and find your next row stitching, lower the foot, and sew. Now notice I'm not always sewing in the same direction. I'm not sewing the same direction that my first row. So doing this different stitching direction will keep the fabric flat. If you always sew in one direction, it's going to shift. This is the beauty of this stitch and turn technique. Now sometimes, and not right at this point, but as you get to the end of the seam, you'll have to turn more than a quarter turn. When that happens, then cut your threads and start to sew at another corner. I found it's about 4 to 5 rows sometimes, depending upon the fabric. Notice now I'm crossing one of the stitch seams. Everything's lying flat. And I'll stop after a couple of more rows just to show you the technique. So we'll raise the presser foot, raise the needle, pivot, sew this little corner, lower the foot again, and sew. Now let's say you would have to turn more than a quarter turn, a half a turn. Simply cut the threads and start in an opposite corner. We'll start in this corner that hasn't been stitched, and then just do the process again. Start sewing along the line, and once you reach the end, then raise your foot, raise the needle, and do a quarter turn. And you stitch until all of the rows have been quilted. And that's the stitch and turn process. This sample has been quilted. All the mark lines have now been stitched, and notice there's a shifting of the fabric. And we stitched it, or I stitched it with all the fabric to the left of the needle, which makes it so convenient, that stitch and turn technique. Now to grid this, to make it square so that it will look nice and neat, and I'm simply going to trim off about 1/4 of an inch or so to start off with at the corner, one edge, and then do another trimming along the outer edge, and you'll be trimming all of the 4 corners. I'm just going to trim one corner for you right now so that it measures 19 by approximately 13, or you could make it any size you'd like. You notice that in our finished sample we had rounded corners, and I like to use the rounded corner curved corner ruler, and you can create 3 different corner shapes or get a sharp corner. Just place this ruler, acrylic ruler, at the corner, align the edges, and then cut. You can do this at all 4 corners, nice and round, and continue trimming and cutting until you have the placemats all the correct size. Use your favorite binding technique to apply contrasting or coordinating binding around the edges. And now you've learned a great quilting technique as well as creating a home decorating project. Nancy's Notions offers a full selection of sewing notions to test out your new sewing and quilting skills. Order your supplies today.